From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Jeffrey Brown. I'm with the PBS NewsHour. Thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. I want to thank my friends at the Library of Congress for putting this on and for asking me to participate. I've been at the festival many times, often participating in one form or another, but most often just as one of you, as a lover of literature, a lover of history, a lover of books, a citizen of the book world. When I travel around the country and I meet up with NewsHour viewers who recognize me and want to come and talk, so often I'm struck by what they want to talk about is the art stories that I've done or the conversations with writers and artists. I believe there's a thirst out there for connecting through the word and through art, and there's a thirst throughout our culture for even more of it. I know that I'm preaching to the choir today, but let me preach for just one moment. It is important, especially in our culture today, to bring literature and art into our daily lives, especially into our public lives. And so, yes, here on the National Mall, this wonderful public space. It's why I feel so strongly that there needs to be a place for the arts and culture on a nightly news program like the NewsHour. There is, thank you again, there is an unfortunate and unhealthy disconnect between the world of the mind, history, and the arts and the public sphere that I spend my daily life in. Right here today, we're making a connection, and I'm pleased to be part of it. That leads us to our speaker, and the reason I was also pleased to be asked to introduce him, because Taylor Branch is one of the preeminent connectors of our era. He connects the past and the present. He connects deep scholarship with a general public. He is a teller of our story, the American story, to us, the American people, and to others around the world. He is, of course, best known for his landmark trilogy of the civil rights movement, America in the King Years, the first volume of which, Parting the Waters, won the Pulitzer Prize. The entire series has won numerous awards, as has Mr. Branch himself. I want to mention one other book in particular because it was of special interest to me. His 2009 book, The Clinton Tapes, Wrestling History with the President. It was a fascinating personal tale of his many years working with President Clinton on an oral history of those years. I had a chance to talk with him about it on the NewsHour. His new book is The King Years, Historic Moments in the Civil Rights Movement, looking at key episodes from that era. And of course, it could not be more timely as we look back 50 years at the March on Washington recently and on so much else. I've had the pleasure of talking with Taylor Branch several times for the NewsHour, and now you have the great pleasure of being here with him. Ladies and gentlemen, Taylor Branch.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks all of you for coming. This is a very exciting time, and I hope to use the civil rights history to look forward rather than backward, because I think all of you as citizens own an equal share of this country devoted to the idea of equal citizenship, and that we should aspire to the model of the civil rights era in which even 8-year-old children who were denied the right to vote advanced freedom and democracy by studying its basic principles and taking risks to make it real. So I think the civil rights movement is about our past, but it's also about our future, which has a number of implications for those of us who are not students. One of them is that we should be concerned when our schools are teaching only reading and math, because history in America, the only country in the world founded on an idea, is how we learn what citizenship means. Our citizenship, to some degree, is paralyzed by the age of gridlock. And I think that we are, to some degree, responsible for it ourselves. This little book, my compact book, is dedicated to students of freedom and teachers of history. The reason that I did it and shed so much blood by eliminating 90% of what I had written over 24 years was because teachers over the years have complained to me that it's half right. My trilogy was half right. Storytelling is what makes history accessible to students. They learn things through human stories, not through abstract categories and argumentation and labels of analysis linked to dates. They get involved with stories, and therefore that's good. However, 900 pages of stories is a lot, even for a college teacher, let alone for a high school teacher. And so they said, try to preserve the stories and give us something that is a little more compact introduction to this era, if you believe that it is so vital, not only to our past, but to our future, and that it is crucially misremembered. We in the United States have a terrible history of misremembering our history when we don't want to remember it. We can turn it upside down. I was born and grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and it was in my textbooks that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, that the slaves were better off here than they had been in Africa, and that the people who restored white rule in the South were known as the Redeemers. That's still true. It's a religious word for terrorists. So we have to be very careful, because race and citizenship and freedom are tricky. And we are in a tricky era right now. I'm using this book to try to teach students now. We had an experiment last spring at the University of Maryland. I live in Baltimore. To teach a seminar on the basics of civil rights history and citizenship to a seminar classroom in Baltimore with online students from Russia and the Solomon Islands and all around the world. We're going to do it again for credit. Our goal is to cut the tuition costs for students by 90% and to open up to the world people who can with some skin in the game and some prospect for credit, gain access to the mastery and the lessons of civil rights history for the world. There's a revolution coming in higher education. Just like the revolution that has come in newspapers and that made Detroit a shadow of itself, and that has affected the book industry itself. This new short book has something called an enhanced ebook edition that I can't read myself, my own book, because I don't have an iPad. You can read along in the ebook for a fraction of the cost of the regular book, and when it says President Kennedy had an interview about Vietnam and civil rights right before he was killed, you can click on it and actually see the interview. Not just the interview, the outtakes, when he and Walter Cronkite stand up in their rocking chair and start gossiping about sailboats. Enhanced ebooks are amazing. There are revolutions coming in all kinds of aspects of American life. In some respects, they are thrilling. In other respects, they are chilling, because none of us wants to be a part of the industry that gets made obsolete. And half of our politics is saying that's what black people are for. They're the ones that should be in the industry that's obsolete, because they've been used to it for 200 years. Blue-collar work went out of work. Farming went out of work. All of the brunt of that fell on black people who have been behind. The great lesson of our future is to what degree we are willing to look to the inspiration and the discipline of American history to form public policies and public trust together to help us have rules and public policy that will advance and help us address the very, very serious problems that we face the way they did in the civil rights era, when an invisible minority that was 10% of the population with none of the traditional tools of politics, no armies, no newspapers. They were not in the paper. The newspapers wouldn't even put most of their social events. They wouldn't even refer to them by name. They had no banks. They had no police force. All they had was a willingness to study and sacrifice for the basic principles of American freedom to lift the rest of the country toward the professed meaning of its own values. And they did it. And it's an amazing story. And it's accessible to children today, in part because it was children in that era who were leaders in it, who confronted problems that made adults mumble and stare the problem in the knees rather than in the eyes. You had college students, and in 1963, in the Freedom Rides and in the sit-ins, at a time when we were so addled by the prospect, it was such a foreign concept that the first sit-ins were dismissed as panty raids. Young people, particularly young black people, can't be addressing serious problems that have befuddled the United States and make the President of the United States, at that time Dwight Eisenhower, sound addled. But they were not addled. They were confronting it. And by 1963, when the rest of the country was saying, essentially, this race problem of segregation in 17 states that takes basic freedoms away from a whole segment of our population is wrong, and somebody should do something about it, but not me, not now. And I can tell you that I myself, growing up in Atlanta, it had finally worn me down. I'd been trying to avoid it my whole childhood. And I said, when I get really impossibly old, like 30, I'm going to stick my toe in this race problem. And no sooner had I said that at the age of 16 than I turned around and turned on the TV, and there were little children in Birmingham marching into dogs and fire hoses, singing the same songs that I sang in Sunday school, and not running from the dogs and fire hoses, and not waiting until they were 30, and not waiting till they had any of the advantages that I had growing up middle class in Atlanta. And it was so stupefying to me that eventually it changed the direction of my life's interests against my will. Where did that come from? It was their activity, this stupefying gambit by Martin Luther King when his whole movement was about to go down the tubes, was condemned by every political figure in the United States, from George Wallace and Robert Kennedy to Malcolm X, to use small children in those demonstrations, as young as 8 and 6 years old, by the thousands, when they could only get, the conditions in the movement in Birmingham were so intimidating to black adults that they could only get 10 or 12. With the greatest Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech sermon in the church, they could only get 10 or 12 adults. They were terrified. But they got 1,000 kids to march on May 2nd, and they got another 1,000 to march on May 3rd. And it melted the emotional resistance to dealing with the fundamental issues of American freedom as presented by race, for not only across the United States and not only in me as a 16-year-old, but all around the world, which is one of the reasons that the civil rights movement is a greater inspiration outside the United States today than it is inside. They were singing "We Shall Overcome" when they took the Berlin Wall down. They were singing "We Shall Overcome" when Nelson Mandela came out of prison and said that the answer to apartheid is not Armageddon, but a multiracial democracy at great risk and great effort to all of us. This inspiration has gone around the world, and we have been, to some degree, trapped in it, and I'm going to give you 2 reasons that I think we're trapped in it. They all grow out of the book. They're not the kind of thing that I try to teach young people in absorbing the stories and the inspiration of this, but they are ideas that I think we should address today as citizens in a gridlock democracy. I mentioned them, by the way, thank you for Jeffrey Brown, but I mentioned them to Gwen Ifill on the NewsHour the other night and got a real double take. I said that the greatest unexamined question in American politics today is to what degree the underpinnings of partisan gridlock are racial. What? And as we came out of this, she kind of danced around that a little bit, and we came out and she says, do you mind if I ask President Obama, if I get to interview him, whether he thinks the underpinnings of gridlock that he's suffering with so much and that's threatening to shut down our government and everything else right now are racial? And I said, of course not. She says, well, I'm going to throw you under the bus. And sure enough, the very next day she got an interview with President Obama and said, this historian says this, and Obama danced all around it. But it is dangerous, it is delicate, but race throughout American history has been the gateway to the advancement of freedom and to the blockage of freedom. It's the gateway where we go through. Two ways of looking at it. 1963, 50 years ago, segregation ruled. 17 states. George Wallace had just been inaugurated governor with his famous speech, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He talked about nothing but race. 50 years ago in September this month, he flew to Baltimore, my home city, and announced that he was going to run for president and never mentioned race. He never mentioned segregation again. He turned on a dime when the March on Washington and those Birmingham demonstrations made it obvious that in the future, overt segregation and talking overtly about race was no longer going to be respectable. He switched his message adroitly. He said he was running only to restore local government against big government by pointy-headed bureaucrats, tyrannical judges, and tax spin legislators, and that he had never denigrated the race of any person or group of people in history. And people wanted to believe it. And that's the beginning of misremembering history. And that's the beginning of the vocabulary of modern politics. And if you don't believe that big government opposition today and that the notion that what makes me safe and makes me free is not all of the painstaking ties that we've built up over 2 centuries of democracy for our economy and for our politics, but the pistol that I carry into Starbucks. If you don't believe that that's not driven by race, ask yourself, why is it that big government is only a slogan and never analyzed? What part of big government? The big government in the Pentagon, the big government in foreign policy, the big government in the Homeland Security Agency that frisks you but whenever you get into an airplane? No, it's only the big government that could conceivably put you in a position of common citizenship with somebody that makes you fearful or makes you anxious. That's big government. That's where it comes from. That's why Obamacare works only as a slogan that mentions Obama and therefore a racial signal, and Obamacare and a piece of legislation without anything about it, and doesn't address the fact that if you got rid of it, the presumption is that we would have a nirvana system. Our medical system works miracles, but it also is by far the most expensive one in the world, and we have convinced ourselves that it is a rational system to route every payment, including for a dental checkup, through vast bureaucracies of profit-making insurance companies. So the notion that we are imprisoned in a system that is a choice between Obamacare and an unspecified nirvana that is not really nirvana is a measure of our gridlock, and it is driven by irrational fear and apprehension that is similar to the fear and apprehension that all of us face about things that confront us in the modern world. Even me in the book business, my book business is dissolving in many respects, so we all have to adapt to that. Now, lastly, and I want to take some questions because I'm trying to essentially say that our democracy is as simple as these wonderful stories of the 8-year-old girls marching into the dogs and fire hoses, but it's also basic and challenging as democracy itself, and we're not dealing with it very well today. It's easy to say that gridlock all belongs on the other side of people who are fearful and who are cussing big government and transmuting their latent fear and hostility on racial grounds to the government itself, which, among other things, is anti-patriotic. Our whole government since the very beginning has been about what we can build. The Tea Party was a purely destructive movement. It's great that you go back to basics, but it was about revolting against a foreign government that had allegiance to the king. The hard work began after that. What kind of government are we going to build? And everybody from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King is saying we're going to build something together through government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's what's patriotic. That's what they have in common. That's why I call the modern civil rights movement modern founders. They were doing just what they did. Our side, the people who appreciate the movement, is complicit in our gridlock for two reasons, and they're not easy to talk about. But I want to throw them out because I think we need to get out of this notion that the only hope we have is for the other side to drop dead. The people who appreciate the racial aspects of advancement in American history, historically, from the very beginning of our republic, through the Civil War, through the Progressive era, through the Civil Rights era, and now today down to Obama. The people who appreciate the racial aspects talk only about race. They don't enlarge it, they don't pay attention to the lesson that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement all talked about, the larger premise of judgment and of justice, and used race as a doorway to talk about it. The people, on the other hand, who showed up at the march the other day, and this was, to me, the most hopeful thing about the 50th anniversary march. You had representatives from all the collateral movements that benefited from the Civil Rights era. The senior citizens, the gay rights movement, the women's movement, the disabled movement, on, stood up and said, I am standing here because of what the civil rights movement did. That's half the formula. Make race relations the doorway to things that benefit everyone. Dr. King said famously in a line that is the first to be forgotten, that when the civil rights movement got rid of segregation in the South, some of the chief beneficiaries would be white Southerners, because their whole system was imprisoned psychologically, economically, and politically in a system of segregation that depended on trying to keep people degraded. It degraded everyone. And that when segregation went, what did you hear about? The Sun Belt. You never heard of the Sun Belt when it was segregated. It was the hookworm belt. We were poor. My mayor, Ivan Allen in Atlanta, said as soon as the Civil Rights Bill passed, not quite 50 years ago, the city of Atlanta built a sports stadium on land it didn't own, with money it didn't have, for a team it hadn't located, and lured the first professional sports team, the Atlanta Braves, from Milwaukee to Atlanta. It opened up the whole world. Every politician in the South who cusses the civil rights movement stands on its shoulders for its prosperity, for the hopes and dreams of their daughters, who now can go to Princeton and Yale and even my university, the University of North Carolina, that only admitted nursing students when I was there in the 1960s. We take all this for granted. We need to have an open-minded discussion where we're all more comfortable about talking about race, but we're not paralyzed in talking about race only. We're not fearful that we're going to insult some spokesman for a different racial group, that we are diminishing them by talking about things that they set in motion that liberated everyone, the larger justice. So let us all, the reason that civil rights education is so valuable is because it's accessible to children. It's because it addresses issues of freedom that affect all of us. It makes race the gateway to the promise of democracy, and that when you recognize the deficiencies of democracy today in race, in our jails, in our poverty rates, in our school to jail, in our drug wars, it is not imprisoning you there in the race issue and in hopelessness, but it is going through that you realize the larger connections and possibilities that the civil rights movement once opened, with less resources, less hope, facing more difficult problems, when an audience like this in my lifetime would have everybody's palms sweaty just for fear that a mixed audience would draw either the Klan or the police, or would have somebody's father lose their business because the customers thought they were race mixers. That kind of terror is gone in every breath that we draw. Our gratitude for that kind of terror, for that kind of freedom, should never be taken for granted. Through this history, we not only regain the balance of what it means to be an American devoted to freedom, but we regain the tools, the habits, the literacy, the cross-cultural genius at the heart of America to address the problems before us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's very, very kind. I was trying to mix in a little scolding with inspiration, but I appreciate that anyway, because I just don't want us to be complacent. This stuff is too serious. So if we're not thinking about what we're doing wrong, we're not, as my old football coach said, if it's not hurting, it's not doing any good. So we have time for questions until they stop us, and I've raised some difficult ideas, but the questions don't have to be on any of that. You can ask, this is a vast subject. The first question the other day was, plaintively, is it really true that Martin Luther King was only 5'6"? Yes. The next question. Yes, sir.
I want to compliment you on a gorgeous, eloquent speech, full of wisdom, really. One just has to listen and be totally impressed. And I think the most ironic thing with your speech is that the people who can benefit it the most, who work about 300 yards from where you are speaking, are not here to listen as we did. A beautiful speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one quick comment on that. Members of Congress didn't show up at the March on Washington 50 years ago either. Yeah. There were only a couple. In 1963, what they did instead was that they had a quorum call to spread upon the pages of the record the names of anybody who was not there, because they wanted to attack anybody who showed up at this march. Never be convinced that the March on Washington 50 years ago was a warm and fuzzy event. Right. There were riot troops stationed all around. They canceled elective surgery, and to me, the most they banned liquor sales for the first time since Prohibition. They were so scared of this thing. But to me, the real kicker is that Major League Baseball, which has played right through floods and World War II and everything, a week before the March on Washington, postponed not one, but 2 Washington Senators games, the day of the march and the day after, for fear that we'd still be cleaning up the results of Armageddon. Those are the unspoken signals of race. Most of us who deal with race deal with it 99% subliminally before we deal with the concepts that we frame. It's not to say that framing concepts is not, and dealing with it and adjusting and governing ourselves is not our highest duty. But we're kidding ourselves when we think that we're in complete control over this thing and that all of us to some degree are not racialized. Racist is a difficult word because it means overtly organizing your whole life around a system. But racialized, we are all racialized, and the question is what we're going to do about it and how much of our minds, souls, and inspiration we're going to apply to it. Yes, ma'am, on this side.
Hi, my name's Sylvia Henderson, and I wrote a book a few years ago called Why You Talk So White, and it was about what the questions I got asked by my peers because I learned to speak well, I guess.
Speak white, that's all right.
When I was interviewed few years ago during the Don Imus debacle,
Yes.
I got asked, a comment was made about, you just explained some things to us on the radio in a way that made talking about race safe, for lack of a better word. So as I listen to you now and agree with a lot of what you say, what strikes me is we need some kind of language. We need to learn how to speak about race so that it is not threatening to either side, any side, all sides, whatever. How do we learn that language in a day of antagonistic internet comments, the moment somebody says something, and the world we live in?
Yes, it's very difficult because people, when you try to raise the subject at all in today's media age, people are only listening for the first spitball.
Right.
And when they get the first spitball, the conversation is set because it's going to be trying to get a spitball going back the other direction. And that is our atrophied public discourse. The civil rights movement, but the thing is, the civil rights movement never took the... They faced that problem too. They couldn't get stuff in the newspapers, but that wasn't the end of it. That was the beginning of it. Well, what are we going to do about it? Do we have to write down the names and addresses of all the reporters and start badgering them and sending them what we think these stories are? Are we going to have to amplify our words with witness and sacrifice? You know, we need to make... The real challenge is never to take any stumbling block in racial dialogue as the final stumbling block where we give up and say, you know, they have to drop dead. I think the key, which you probably, it sounds like you already have, is that every conversation about race as it has affected American democracy should begin with the premise that talking about race makes us bigger. It enlarges the story. It does not pigeonhole the story. And that's not to say that there are not some people who talk about race who only want to use it as a grievance to bang people over the head and who are not opening up. But we need to displace those people by conversations that say this is the gateway, historically and every other way, the gateway to a larger freedom for everyone. There are no magic answers, but I think the first answer is to never take today's failure as the end. It's the beginning of the question, how do we get around it? Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very, very much. You know, you are nothing but like a ball of fire, man. You're a ball of fire. I mean, so you inspire me. You really do. And I think more white people need to learn how to talk like you do. Because if they did, we'd open up this conversation. Now, I'm on the faculty of the University of Maryland, and we are in College Park, and we're taking on this issue, especially in the area of health and health disparities. We believe this is where Jim Crow is still hiding out. And I hope that one day you'll take this on to expose the tentacles of racism and discrimination that have permeated our society. My question is this. There's sometimes pain when we delve into the story. And what haunts me is some of the photos and the images of that period, when we would see black men hanging, being lynched, but there would be a picnic, there would be a festival with children. Who were those people? Who were those children who are now adults? What fear do they have in going into that history? That's deep, man. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that? That trauma that we have all experienced as a people. Get through that trauma to get to the healing side.
Well, that's a tough question, but you open up one part of I can't tell you how many people I interviewed in Mississippi going back 30 years or more now. How many black folks said that they were raised being told in their household, do not talk about Emmett Till. Why? It's dangerous. And number two, it's embarrassing. The story is dangerous, it is painful, and it is revealing of our helplessness. So the notion of avoiding racial discussion is not just a white issue because you're afraid you might offend somebody or display your ignorance or that sort of thing that you need to get over. The great model for that is Robert Kennedy, who was as naive and silly about race as anybody, but he kept banging away at it. He was existential. He would do something to somebody and then he'd feel guilty about it, and he'd talk to them and he'd ask why, and he grew doing it. And I think that's what we need to have. But the images of lynchings, they are very, very difficult issues for both races. But to me, they are little emblems of how quickly people can, in the future, those people will adjust to those memories, and we remember about race what we want to remember. And you can, to the degree that you can turn it upside down. And that's what we really have to guard against in all of our conversations, to go through that pain and say there's something bigger and better on the other side, but it's part of the courage that it takes to be a democratic citizen in a country that says the people are the ones who are responsible for the government. If the government's screwing up, it's not just the people in the government, it's me. Diane Nash is one of my favorite people from the civil rights era. Some of you may know her, but she was the leader of the sit-ins, the freedom rides, everything. Her family was harassed by the FBI. And in one of my interviews with her, I said, Diane, I showed her some of these FBI documents about what they'd done, petty little things. And she says, oh, I don't bother with that. That was just Hoover. And I said, what do you mean that was just Hoover? That's the FBI. They did a lot of terrible stuff. And he said, yes, but I blame us for Hoover. We left him in a position of arbitrary secret power for 50 years. And anybody who studies American government in the 6th grade should know you're going to get just what you got, an autocrat whose world was small and wanted to run things. I blame us. So here's Diane Nash, who's black and cannot vote herself, but she's assuming responsibility for J. Edgar Hoover instead of a sense of victimhood. And so that is an amazing example to me of the kind of wisdom that these young people, she was only 23 years old when she's doing all this stuff with J. Edgar Hoover. So there's a lot of wisdom here, and there are no easy answers, but it really does make our history just enthralling, I think.
Thank you, and keep on keeping on.
Yes, sir.
So on the subject of this national gridlock, I was contemplating maybe we could ask Fort Detrick to develop a party-specific plague for one side or the other. I really don't care which. But absent Fort Detrick being able to do this, what do you think is the path forward on how to solve this stupid, crazy gridlock?
You've got to apply all your heart, soul, mind, and body to trying to detach some people on the other side from the irrationality that they're trapped in. The anti-big government side, it does seem to me, has pretty much reached a cul-de-sac because there's a larger and larger body of the people. It appeals to fear, anxiety, but also pride in the sense of saying, well, if I didn't just have all these public obligations and people asking me to, pay a small amount for food stamps, I'd be better off. I don't need any of our public conveyances, anything that we have. I'd be better off digging my own plumbing. That appeals to people's pride, but it's not true. And we have to figure out ways to show people that if they had the same initiative, the same education, the same genius in Sudan or in Uruguay, they wouldn't have the same possibility. We get an awful lot about from what we've built together. Our checks clear, our roads meet. The public space is a glorious example of our cooperation, but it's all invisible, therefore can be taken for granted, and it makes people susceptible to politicians who are saying, you may be scared of all these other people, and you'd be even better off if you listen to me and strangle the government in the bathtub. And we have to figure out ways to peel off people, because some people are that way. Very, very wealthy people are lobbying and spending a lot of money to basically have the government pay them. but they rely on the great masses of people who are deluded by propaganda, and we have to figure out how to address that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to the kids you were talking about. Are we getting a generation of teenagers to, say, 8 or 9-year-olds that are going to be capable of doing what those kids did then? And particularly with reference to the Common Core, in an effort to really force-feed competence in this generation coming up, are we losing any way of inculcating them in the history and the culture that they're going to need to mount the same kind of thing that was done then?
Well, I started out by saying we're teaching history less and less, and that is dangerous. That is, to me, that's one of the scariest things, that we are de-emphasizing American history and citizenship in our core curriculum in the United States. You could turn it around and say, if you're in my generation and you have benefited, because I think that the breakthrough in Birmingham in 1963 opened up doors for equal citizenship for our whole generation, far beyond what they did. We're indebted to them. We could repay young people. Young people did something for us. We need to do something for them by helping to restore that education and by really studying and not approaching young people on the basis of what we may have heard. Some young people are far more liberated and natural in their views and our antiquated prejudices, and they're free of them, but some of them are still getting trapped in them, and they're also not being educated. So we have to encourage the good part and try to rescue our education so that it makes the kind of citizenship example from 50 years ago more pertinent to today. Thank you.
Have we got teachers to do it?
Have we got teachers to do it? We have some. Our best teachers today, I think one of the saddest things about, I'm not an expert in education. I've just met enough teachers who were heroic to me. Gosh, I met teachers in Idaho. The Gilder Lehrman Institute sent me to Idaho, Mormon, Idaho, who are teaching civil rights history, and at 10 o'clock on Sunday night, they're Googling Diane Nash to try to find something to present to their teacher, to their students the next day that would be accessible. They're heroic, but they're really undermanned. In many respects, we are slipping into a notion that we accept the idea that being a teacher is more or less like being a military draftee was in the 1950s, that you can only do it for 4 or 5 years and then you're going to be burnt out. So they are heroic, but we do not, as a whole society, treat teaching and both the content and the professional core and life of it with the seriousness that it deserves if it really governs our future in the information age.
Could I ask you to restate your question for the president?
Thank you.
Yeah. Over the years, Dr. King has been repackaged in a lot of ways by corporations. You know, a McDonald's placemat, a day of service. How do we go about reclaiming Dr. King and making it clear this was one of the key progressive voices of his time?
Great question. Did everybody hear that? Dr. King has been repackaged by everybody. How do we go about reclaiming the genuine? First of all, I do believe that personal stories are the key to that. If you reduce somebody just to a concept or an idea or a label, then it can be refuted with another label. And you can have Ralph Reed, like he did the other day, say that Dr. King's whole career was about saying that it's only the content of your character and that it was a movement about families and not about politics and public change. When anybody who studied Martin Luther King's career for 5 minutes knows that I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, delivered on the mall. He came to the mall to do that. This is about our public purpose. So to say that that he's an anti-government person too is preposterous. But that's what happens when we and they reduce everything to sound bites. The stories are key. You have to pick the right stories that people relate to. One of the reasons that I was obsessed to try to put down a storytelling record of this whole period is that storytelling things that are human are harder to refute. That's why we are all eternally grateful that in the Depression that the Roosevelt administration took those oral histories of slaves, the few remaining slaves who could talk from personal experience about what it was like. Otherwise, slavery was an idea, and it was as vulnerable to anybody else's counter idea that they were well off and they were all happy. But you had personal testimony. Personal testimony matters, and what the rest of us need to do is to find a bit of personal story about Martin Luther King that illustrates the part of him and his public ministry and that you want to pass on and preserve. It's there, but we just need to do a better job of passing it along. To me, the greatest thing about Martin Luther King was that he could speak about religion and politics in every speech constantly and was never accused of mixing church and state, which is remarkable. And it's because he did it with such an amazing adroitness. He'd say, you want equal souls? Fine. You want equal votes? Fine. You know, they both lead to the same place. They both lead to justice. They go through race. And he's not trying to subject one to the other, which is how you get in trouble with that. So, and there are examples of that. So I think the best general notion about how you refute the tendency, it's a proven historical tendency to distort and even invert lessons from race to make them more compatible with what you want to believe, is to preserve personal stories that have the truth in them. And that's all the time we have. I'm sorry. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.